The Pacific Ocean in the early days of June 1942 was a landscape defined by tension and uncertainty, a vast blue arena where the fate of the entire American war effort rested on the precarious survival of a handful of ships. The immediate prelude to the Battle of Midway was a desperate scramble by the United States Navy to reconstitute its forces following the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. The loss of the battleship fleet had left the aircraft carriers, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet, as the sole fragile spearhead capable of confronting the seemingly unstoppable might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By the time the massive Japanese invasion fleet, commanded by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was sighted moving toward Midway Atoll, the American carriers had already endured weeks of relentless, high-stakes operational tempo. They were tired, their aircraft were battered, and their crews were operating on minimal rest, fueled by adrenaline and sheer necessity. The USS Yorktown, in particular, arrived at the rendezvous point off Midway, bearing the fresh scars of the Battle of the Coral Sea, hastily and miraculously repaired in just 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, a feat of engineering and speed that bordered on legend, but left her still dangerously vulnerable. When the two carrier fleets finally collided in the waters off Midway, the result was swift, brutal, and utterly decisive. Through a combination of incredible luck, timely intelligence, the breaking of the Japanese code, and decisive tactical action by American dive bombers, the Japanese carrier fleet, the very core of the Pearl Harbor attack force, was shattered. 4 of Japan's best, most formidable aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were engulfed in flames and sent to the bottom of the sea. This was the vengeance the entire nation had craved, a victory so complete and unexpected that it instantly shifted the strategic balance in the Pacific. The tactical victory was absolute, achieving the impossible by neutralizing the enemy's offensive capability in a single lightning-fast exchange. Yet this stunning triumph came at a tremendous cost that fundamentally shaped the decision-making of the American High Command. The victory was far from clean. The American forces had lost the veteran carrier USS Yorktown, crippled by Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes, leaving her a floating wreck, soon to be finished by a Japanese submarine. The air crews were depleted. Veteran pilots, who represented years of training and experience that was difficult to quickly replace, had been lost, and those who remained were running on fumes, their aircraft riddled with damage. Crucially, the United States was left with only 2 operational fleet carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean, the Enterprise and the Hornet. This asset scarcity was the central strategic reality facing Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Japanese, despite their catastrophic loss, still possessed several operational aircraft carriers elsewhere, and most importantly, the massive surface fleet of powerful battleships and heavy cruisers that remained largely untouched. This naval arithmetic was terrifying. One wrong move, one lost carrier, and the strategic victory won at Midway would instantly revert to a desperate, perhaps irretrievable advantage for the enemy. The initial thrilling success had created the temptation of total victory, a powerful emotional urge to chase the retreating, battered enemy fleet and annihilate them entirely. But it was a temptation fraught with mortal danger, demanding an act of supreme strategic discipline to resist. The strategic brilliance of Admiral Chester Nimitz's ultimate decision to halt the pursuit rested on a clear-eyed assessment of the 2 mortal threats that awaited his surviving fleet in the vast expanse of the Pacific. It was a situation that demanded more than raw courage. It demanded perfect information, impeccable judgment, and a profound understanding of the enemy's established doctrine.
Nimitz, safely back in Pearl Harbor but fully keyed in to the operational picture through secure communications, knew that the emotional urge to crush the retreating Japanese fleet was a suicide trap set by the realities of naval combat. The first, most immediate, and potentially catastrophic threat was the Imperial Japanese Navy's formidable surface fleet. While the Americans had miraculously destroyed the 4 vital aircraft carriers, the main body of the Japanese invasion force, commanded by Admiral Yamamoto himself, still consisted of a devastating array of heavy battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. These ships were largely undamaged and represented a weight of heavy shell fire that Nimitz's 2 remaining carriers and their escorts could not hope to match in a straight-up gunfight. Crucially, Japanese naval doctrine highly favored night action. Trained extensively for low-visibility combat, the Japanese commanders would have eagerly maneuvered to engage the American carriers under the cover of darkness. In the confusion of a night battle, the massive advantage of American air superiority would vanish, replaced by the brutal, close-range power of torpedoes and 16-inch guns. Nimitz knew that if his 2 surviving carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, were caught by Yamamoto's battleship group after sunset, they would likely be destroyed, wiping out the entire operational carrier force in the Pacific in one single devastating moment. The victory at Midway would have been rendered strategically meaningless. The second, more insidious threat was the persistent fog of war and the unknown location of the enemy. Despite the phenomenal success of Allied code-breaking, Operation Magic, which had provided the advantage necessary to win the carrier battle, the information was never perfect. Nimitz and the commander on the scene, Admiral Raymond Spruance, were acutely aware that they had lost track of several key Japanese units, including support forces, transports, and potentially other aircraft carriers that were not part of the main striking force. Chasing the visible remnants of the defeated carriers deep into the Central Pacific would have been an act of blind faith, exposing the vulnerable American fleet to ambush from forces whose location and strength were uncertain. Furthermore, the exhausted condition of the American air crews added an unbearable layer of risk. Pilots were running on exhaustion, planes were damaged, and the efficiency required for a complex night pursuit or a second-day engagement was dangerously compromised. Nimitz understood that pushing his forces past the point of reasonable endurance could lead to costly operational errors or invite a devastating counterattack. The Admiral's cold strategic calculus was clear. The primary mission was to preserve the remaining American assets, not to satisfy the emotional urge for total annihilation. The United States could easily replace aircraft and pilots, but it would take months, if not years, to replace a lost aircraft carrier. The fate of the entire Pacific theater rested upon preserving those 2 final, fragile ships.
The moment of decision arrived on the afternoon of June 4, 1942, a moment that would define the character and strategic philosophy of Admiral Chester Nimitz, executed flawlessly by his subordinate commander at sea, Admiral Raymond Spruance. With the 4 Japanese carriers confirmed sunk and the immediate threat of air attack neutralized, the tactical situation transitioned into a complex, high-risk strategic calculation. Spruance, commanding the surviving carriers Enterprise and Hornet, knew that the Japanese main body, still lurking somewhere to the west, retained overwhelming superiority in surface firepower. The sun was beginning its descent, and with the onset of darkness, the protective umbrella of American aircraft would be rendered ineffective. This looming reality necessitated the crucial, controversial order: do not pursue the retreating enemy after nightfall. This was not a failure of courage or a sign of exhaustion, but an act of supreme strategic self-denial rooted in the cold, hard logic of preserving scarce resources. The first and foremost reason for this order of restraint was the fundamental objective of the war in the Pacific.
Nimitz's strategy was not focused on winning a single battle, but on ensuring the long-term, inevitable industrial victory of the United States. To risk the last two functioning carriers in the entire theater, assets that represented billions of dollars and years of buildup, was strategically unacceptable. A successful night ambush by Yamamoto's battleships would have set the American war effort back a full year, giving the Japanese the breathing room to recoup their carrier losses and potentially secure their perimeter irrevocably. By pulling back, Nimitz guaranteed the survival of the Enterprise and Hornet, ensuring that the U.S. Navy could immediately transition to the offensive operations that would soon follow at Guadalcanal. Furthermore, the decision was a crucial protective measure for the fragility of the American intelligence advantage. Nimitz knew the only reason the Americans had been in the right place at the right time was the success of the magic cryptanalysts in breaking the Japanese naval code JN-25. A relentless, overly aggressive pursuit by the American fleet, especially one that resulted in a disproportionate victory or uncanny tactical success, risked sending a glaring red flag to the Japanese high command. If the Japanese suspected their code was compromised, they would instantly change their cryptographic systems, blindfolding the Americans and sacrificing the single greatest intelligence asset of the war. By allowing the Japanese fleet to retreat largely unmolested and without a final annihilating blow, Nimitz reinforced the Japanese misconception that the Americans had merely gotten lucky or that their own forces were too damaged to pursue. This restraint was a calculated move to preserve the sanctity of the intelligence pipeline. Finally, the order reflected the practical limits of his forces. The crews were utterly spent, having fought continuously for days. Their aircraft required immediate maintenance and rearming, and the fuel reserves of the accompanying destroyers were low. Pushing these tired men and machines into a chaotic, blind night engagement against an enemy specializing in that very scenario was an invitation to operational catastrophe. This deliberate choice to walk away from total destruction, prioritizing the long-term war-winning objectives over immediate, tempting revenge, solidified Admiral Nimitz's reputation as a commander of unparalleled strategic foresight, capable of making the hardest decision of all, knowing precisely when to stop.
The refusal by Admiral Chester Nimitz to authorize the pursuit of the battered but still dangerous retreating Japanese fleet was a strategic masterpiece whose success was measured by the absence of reaction from the Imperial Japanese High Command. The Japanese confirmation details how Nimitz's calculated restraint successfully reinforced the enemy's existing prejudices and blind spots, ensuring that the greatest American advantage, the breaking of the JN-25 Naval Code, remained intact, undetected, and fully operational for the crucial months ahead. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the main Japanese surface fleet from his flagship, the Yamato, was a man reeling from unimaginable defeat. The loss of 4 frontline aircraft carriers was an irreversible blow, one that instantly nullified the naval parity Japan had enjoyed since Pearl Harbor. However, Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist himself, was also a prisoner of his own strategic doctrine and the culture of his high command. The American decision not to press the attack after the carrier strikes played directly into 2 powerful pre-existing Japanese misconceptions about their American counterparts. Firstly, the Japanese believed that American commanders were fundamentally cautious and risk-averse. This belief stemmed from a deep cultural and doctrinal difference. While the Japanese Navy emphasized decisive, all-out, often reckless offensive action, they viewed the Americans as methodical and slow to commit to a decisive engagement. When the American fleet stopped pursuit, Yamamoto and his staff interpreted this not as a strategic maneuver to preserve precious assets, but as confirmation of this inherent American timidity. They concluded that the American fleet must have suffered crippling losses they were hiding, or that the commanders lacked the aggressive spirit required to capitalize on their advantage.
This interpretation was the exact opposite of the truth, but allowed the Japanese to rationalize the inexplicable defeat. The Americans had merely gotten lucky, and their luck was now balanced by their caution. This psychological cushion prevented any immediate, deep inquiry into the true source of the American presence at Midway. Secondly, and most critically, the immediate aftermath did not provoke the panic necessary to compromise the JN-25 code. If the American fleet had pressed the attack, exhibiting an uncanny knowledge of Japanese positions, movements, and future intentions, the Japanese command might have been forced to consider the unthinkable, cryptanalysis. A relentless pursuit, marked by pinpoint accuracy in finding and engaging targets in the fog of war, would have screamed code compromise. By choosing discretion, Nimitz shielded the source of his knowledge. The Japanese, believing the defeat was due to poor luck, bad timing, and a series of tactical errors by their own pilots, poured their energy into operational reorganization and blaming individual commanders, rather than investigating the fundamental security of their communications. The belief that the Americans are lucky but not brilliant allowed the intelligence division of the Imperial Japanese Navy to confidently assure their superiors that their code remained secure, thus delaying any substantial cryptographic overhaul for months. The consequence of this strategic restraint was immense. The American fleet secured not just a military victory at Midway, but a sustained intelligence victory that would prove even more vital in the subsequent months. The unbroken magic pipeline allowed Nimitz to foresee Japanese movements during the crucial initial battles for Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. This was the true payoff of the order of restraint. The Japanese were allowed to retreat with their psychological pride wounded, but their communications protocols untouched. Nimitz had sacrificed the glory of total annihilation at Midway to secure the sustained, secret advantage that would bleed the Imperial Japanese Navy dry over the course of the next year, ensuring that the strategic tide of the Pacific War could never be turned back. The commander's refusal of revenge secured the greater, lasting victory.
The final consequence of Admiral Chester Nimitz's decision, the act of strategic self-discipline executed during the withdrawal from Midway, was the immediate and irreversible shift of the Pacific War's momentum, confirming that the refusal of revenge was, in fact, the greatest victory of all. The preservation of the two surviving fleet carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, was the single most crucial factor enabling the United States to seize the initiative just 2 months later. Without these ships, the American offensive would have been indefinitely delayed, granting the Japanese High Command the vital time needed to consolidate their vast perimeter and rush new carriers into service. Instead, Nimitz's saved assets provided the necessary naval cover for the invasion of Guadalcanal in August 1942, launching the United States Navy onto the offensive and plunging the Japanese into a brutal attritional campaign they were wholly unprepared to fight. This transition from defense to immediate offense was only possible because the American industrial juggernaut could be unleashed without the crippling delay of replacing lost capital ships. Nimitz had trusted that the American factories would deliver the thousands of planes, the millions of tons of steel, and the new fleet carriers currently sliding down the ways, provided he could preserve the core of his existing fighting force. His calculated risk paid off exponentially, allowing the U.S. to begin the relentless island-hopping campaign that would steadily bleed Japanese manpower, resources, and, most importantly, their highly trained naval air crews, a loss Japan could never replenish. However, the deepest and most profound victory lay in the sustained, silent operation of the magic code-breaking pipeline. Because the Japanese command remained stubbornly convinced that their defeat at Midway was attributable to bad luck and human error rather than cryptanalysis, they made no effort to overhaul their naval codes. Throughout the pivotal Guadalcanal campaign and the subsequent vicious fighting in the Solomon Islands, the American command had an uncanny, almost clairvoyant knowledge of Japanese intentions.
Every major Japanese counterattack, every supply mission, the Tokyo Express, and every deployment of air and sea forces was known to Nimitz's headquarters, sometimes days in advance. This foresight allowed the U.S. forces to constantly preempt, reinforce, and prepare traps for the Japanese, consistently multiplying the effectiveness of their own, often less experienced forces. This intelligence stream was directly responsible for leveling the technological and experience gap between the two forces. The ultimate manifestation of this continued intelligence superiority came in April 1943 with Operation Vengeance, the targeted assassination of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself. Because the Japanese continued to use the same compromised code, American cryptanalysts were able to intercept and decode a detailed message containing Yamamoto's exact itinerary for a morale tour near Bougainville. The ensuing mission, which successfully ambushed and shot down Yamamoto's aircraft, eliminated Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, the very man who had warned his nation of the strategic impossibility of a prolonged war. This singular event, made possible entirely by Nimitz's deliberate restraint at Midway, removed the only Japanese commander who truly grasped the necessity of a decisive, early peace, ensuring that the Japanese military blindly continued down the path of strategic attrition and inevitable defeat. Nimitz's refusal to succumb to the temptation of revenge solidified the long-term victory, ensuring the success of the invasion of Guadalcanal and securing the intelligence dominance that would hasten the end of the war.